Left bound on the depot steps at dawn. Her placard read, "Cast off by kin." The placard was a piece of barn board. Somebody had burned the letters in with a hot iron, the way you'd mark a crate before shipping it west. I could read it from 20 feet off in the gray before sunrise, before I even made out the woman wearing it. She was sitting on the second step from the bottom, not slumped, not curled into herself the way a frightened person sits. She was upright, both hands flat on her thighs, looking straight ahead at the tracks like she was waiting for a train she knew was never coming. Around her neck the cord looked like baling twine held the board against her chest. It was maybe 8 inches by 12. The burned letters said, "Cast off by kin. No longer wanted." I stood there a moment with my coffee cup steaming in my hand. I'd come down early, the way I did every morning, to walk the depot platform before the 6:15 came through from Tucson. Habit from 30 years of wearing a badge in this town. Check the platform, check the freight office, check the water tower hose, and then come back and eat breakfast. Nobody expected it of me anymore. Some mornings I got the feeling nobody had expected it of me in a long time, but I still did it. There are men who do a thing because they're required to, and there are men who do a thing because it is the thing to be done, and if it costs them the knowing that anyone is watching, they do it anyway. I had been the second kind of man my whole life. It had not made me wealthy or celebrated, but it had let me sleep. The platform was otherwise empty. The freight office was locked. The lantern above the main door was still burning on its hook, though the sky behind it was lightening to a flat gray and the lantern's flame was starting to look unnecessary. It was cold, late October, and the cold had gotten serious in the last week. The mountains to the north had put on their first real snow, and the smell of it had come down into the valley and stayed. I walked over to her. She looked up at me without alarm. Her eyes were dark and steady. She was not young, somewhere in her mid-40s, I figured, though I have always been a poor judge of a person's years and know it. Her hair was brown going to gray and pinned up under a hat that had seen better seasons but was sitting correctly on her head, which told me something about her character. Her coat was a woman's traveling coat, gray wool with a small velvet collar, and it was good quality once, though one of the buttons had been replaced with a different button that didn't match. Brown where the others were black. A small thing. But small things tell you a lot about a person's circumstances, and what kind of pride they still manage to hold. She was carrying a small valise which she'd set beside her feet on the step. It was not a large valise. Everything she had in the world was in it, or most of it. I said, "Ma'am." She said, "Marshall." She knew who I was. Most people in Garnet did, or had for a long while, though I was aware that some of the newer families barely looked at me when I passed them on the street. I had a face that had been in this town long enough to be part of its background, like the courthouse or the water trough. I said, "Can I ask how long you've been sitting here?" She said, "Since just before midnight, I believe." I said, "That's a cold night to sit on depot steps." She said it was. I looked at the placard again. She didn't look away or try to hide it or seem ashamed. She just let me look at it the same way you let a doctor look at a wound. There it is. Look if you need to, that's what's there. Her expression didn't change. I said, "Who put that on you?" She said, "My brother and his wife. They had a wagon from Beals Crossing. They set me down here and drove off." I said, "Why here and not in Beals Crossing?" She said, "Because Garnet has a marshal and a judge and Beals Crossing doesn't. I imagine they figured if I caused any trouble here there'd be someone to deal with me." I looked at her a moment. She said it without bitterness, which was its own remarkable thing. Like she was explaining the logic of other people she'd long since stopped expecting better from, and the explaining of it no longer cost her anything. I said, "You're not causing any trouble." She said, "No." I reached out and I lifted the cord off over her hat, careful not to knock it, and I took the placard and I set it against the depot wall face down. I did not say anything about it. I set it face down against the wall and left it there. She watched me do it, then she said, "Thank you." I said, "Have you eaten?" She said, "Not since yesterday morning." I said, "Sadie Friel opens her kitchen at 6. It's cold enough to freeze a man's ears off out here, and I'm going to get breakfast. I'd be obliged if you'd come along." She looked at me for a moment, and I want to say there was something in her face right then, not gratitude, not relief, more like she was measuring something. Like she'd been surprised too many times by the ground shifting under a thing that looked solid, and she had learned to look twice before she leaned. Then she picked up her valise and she stood up and she said, "All right." Her name was Clara Voss. She told me that over coffee and eggs at Sadie Friel's, which was the best eating in the county because Sadie kept her own chickens and fed them good corn and gathered the eggs herself each morning, and you could taste the difference. The place was warm and smelled of wood smoke and biscuits, and the particular smell of a kitchen where someone has been cooking good food for many years. We were the only ones there at that hour. I had 2 cups of coffee before I spoke much, because I am not a man who talks in the morning, and Clara seemed to understand that without being told, which was itself a thing I noticed about her. She drank her coffee and looked at the table and did not try to fill the silence, and when I finally asked her to tell me how she came to be on those steps, she told it plain and in order, starting where it started and not leaving out the parts that reflected poorly on herself. She was from Indiana originally, had come out west when she married a man named Thomas Voss, who ran a freight operation out of Prescott. He was a decent man, she said, not a brilliant one, but reliable and steady and good to her in his way. He died of a chest sickness 2 winters ago, leaving her the house and some debts and not much else. The freight business had been failing before he died. He'd borrowed heavily to expand it, and the expansion hadn't come through the way he'd planned, and the creditors had taken most of what was left by the time the ground thawed in spring. She'd sold the house to cover what the business left behind. After that, she'd gone to her brother Harold's place in Beals Crossing. Harold ran a dry goods operation there, small but steady, and his wife was a woman named Marta who Clara described without malice as a woman who thought well of herself and not much of the people around her. Clara had worked in Harold's store for nearly a year and a half. She kept his books, which had been in a sad state when she arrived, managed his inventory, wrote his correspondence, and made Marta's life easier in a dozen ways she described plain and without asking for credit. She'd taken a room in the back of the house. She'd made herself useful every day and asked for nothing in return except a place to be and the sense of being some kind of use to somebody. Then Marta had decided Clara was a burden and an embarrassment. She was a widow past marrying age, in Marta's view, with no prospects and no resources and no reason to be underfoot. She'd worn Harold down over several months until he'd agreed, and so one evening in October they'd driven her to Garnet in the dark, in the bed of the wagon with her valise, and set her down at the depot at midnight with a placard burned from a board, and driven away. I listened to all of it. I didn't say much. There wasn't much to say that would do any good about any of it. Some things are simply what they are, and saying things about them doesn't change them. It only adds noise to the injury. When she finished, she drank the last of her coffee and looked out Sadie's window at the gray morning street and said, "I don't know what I'm going to do, but I've learned it doesn't help to think too far ahead. You think too far ahead when you've got nothing in your hands. You just scare yourself." I said, "Do you have any money at all?" She said, $4.60. I said, "The Garnet Hotel is run by a man named Perch Walcott. He's a fair man. I'll walk you over and see he gives you a clean room at a decent rate and won't bother you about what you can pay." She looked at me across the table. Her coffee cup was empty. She had eaten everything on her plate and she was not embarrassed about that. She said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Because it's the right thing to do and somebody ought to." She looked at me a moment longer. I think she was trying to determine if that was all of it, or if there was something underneath it she needed to be careful of. Then she nodded, not like she accepted the answer entirely, but like she was willing to let it sit for now, and she stood up. Her room at the Walcott Hotel cost her $1.50 a week. Perch gave her that rate because I asked him to, though Perch Walcott was not a man who needed much asking to treat a person decently. He gave her the room at the back of the second floor that faced east, which caught the morning sun, and was warmer than the rooms on the other side. I should say something about what was happening in this town at that time, because it is part of the story and you need to understand it. Garnet was changing. It had been changing for about 3 years, since the railroad pushed through and brought in a new class of merchant and a new class of ambition. The old Garnet, the one I'd kept order in since before some of these newcomers were born, had been a rough place, honest in its roughness. People had known each other's faces and their histories and what they were capable of. A man's word meant something because his reputation was known. When there was trouble, you dealt with the trouble, and that was that. The new Garnet had a town council that met in a proper room with proper chairs and proper, printed stationery and used words like progress and incorporation and civic development. They wore suits that came from catalogs back east. Some of them were decent enough men in their own way. But they had decided, with the quiet confidence of men who have not yet been tested by anything hard, that they knew better than the men who had built the thing they were now improving. And they had decided that I was not the kind of marshal a town with civic development needed. They hadn't fired me, not yet, but there had been a council meeting which I'd been told about secondhand by a man who'd been there and felt uneasy enough about it to find me afterward, where the topic had been raised and discussed and not decided but also not dropped. What they wanted was someone younger, they said, someone who could grow with the town, someone with a different approach. What they meant was someone who would bend to them, do what he was told, look the other way on the things they wanted looked away from, certain business dealings, certain arrangements between certain men of commerce and certain other men who were not entirely on the right side of legal, and make trouble for the men and women they wanted made trouble for. I was 58 years old. I had been Marshal of Garnet for 22 years. I had buried 2 deputies in that time, both of them good men, and I had stood at both their graves and said what there was to say, and I had kept going the way you keep going when stopping is not something you know how to do. I had been shot twice in the line of duty and stabbed once by a man who thought he was faster than he was, and I had ridden a horse through a burning livery to get a child out. And the scars from that ride were still on the back of my right hand and part of my neck where the hair doesn't grow. I had kept order in this town when order was a harder thing to keep than it was now, and I had done it without corruption and without cruelty, which are the 2 temptations in a lawman's life, and I had held to that even when holding to it cost me. I was not going to bend to them, and they knew it. And so we were in that quiet standoff that happens when one side has all the legal authority and the other side has all the practical power, and neither wants to strike first because striking first shows your hand. That was the country I was standing in the morning. I found Clara Voss on the depot steps. I want to be honest about something. There was the rightness of it, a woman treated like freight by her own family, left without shelter in a town where she knew no one in the cold. That alone was reason enough. If a man will not act when a thing is plainly right in front of him and requires only the small courage of acting, then he is not the man he believes himself to be. So yes, that was enough. But there was also this. I was in a season of my life where very few people were glad to see me walking toward them. I had become, in this changed town, a symbol of something they were trying to move past. Men who'd shaken my hand 10 years ago crossed the street now rather than acknowledge me in front of the council members. Women who'd brought me pies at Christmas the last 20 years had stopped. My deputy Leland was loyal and good, but he was 24 years old and the weight of things hadn't settled into him yet the way it would. I did not fault any of them. People look after themselves. That is the nature of people. but a man gets used to being looked at a certain way, and then one day he looks around and the look has changed without announcement, and he carries the weight of that quietly because there is no other way to carry it, and he keeps doing the work. But something in him is aware of the difference between doing the work, because it is good, and doing the work, because it is the only thing left that tells him who he is. Clara Voss, on those depot steps, had looked up at me and said, "Marshall," like the word still meant something. Like I was still the thing I had always been, and knowing it was as natural as breathing. I don't say that's the whole reason I helped her, but I would be a liar if I said it was none of it. I spent the morning, after I got her settled, doing my rounds. Garnet was quiet on a Tuesday. The saloon, Delworth's, the bigger of the two, didn't open its back card room until afternoon. The hardware store was taking a delivery of iron goods, and there were crates being moved on the boardwalk. The blacksmith was already at his anvil, and the sound of it came steady down the street, each strike as even as a clock. I stopped in at the land office, which was run by a man named Cyrus Abel, who sat on the council and was not one of the friendlier ones. He was at his desk when I came in, and he looked up at me with that particular expression that was too polite to be politeness. The kind of expression a man puts on when he wants you to know you are welcome to leave at any moment. He said, "Marshall, can I help you?" I said, "Just checking in." He said, "Everything's quiet," and went back to his papers. I stood there a moment. I said, "There was a woman left at the depot last night. I've gotten her a room at Walcott's. If anyone comes inquiring about a woman named Voss, I'd appreciate knowing." He looked up again. "Who would be inquiring?" I said, "The family that left her there might change their mind about something. Or they might not be done with her." He said, "I imagine that's a family matter, Marshall." I said, "It stopped being only a family matter when they left her on a public platform in my jurisdiction, with a placard around her neck like she was a stray animal." He looked at me the way he looked at me now, assessing, measuring the distance between what I had the authority to do and what he wanted me to do, which were different calculations. He said, "I'll let you know if anyone asks." He didn't mean it, but it was on record that I'd told him, and record sometimes matters when nothing else does. I saw Clara twice more that day. Once around noon, when I passed the hotel and she was sitting on the front porch with her coat on, looking up the street with that same composed look she'd had on the depot steps, present, taking inventory, not troubled. I nodded to her. She nodded back. The second time was in the late afternoon, when I saw her through the window of the hotel office, sitting across from Perch Walcott, and from the way Perch was sitting, still, both hands on the desk, the way Perch sat when he was genuinely interested, I could see she was not just passing time. I learned what the conversation had been the next morning. She'd asked him if there was work she could do in the hotel to extend her stay beyond what $4.60 would cover. He'd said he couldn't pay much, but he needed someone at the front desk Tuesday and Wednesday mornings when his regular man was in school, and he needed his ledgers gone over because they'd gotten into a state. She'd offered to address the ledgers as well as the desk, and he'd agreed. I found this out because Perch told me when I came in for coffee. He said, "That woman you brought me, she found 2 accounting errors I've been losing money on since last July. One in the room rate column and one in the linen tallies. I'd been looking at that linen line for 6 months and couldn't see what was wrong with it." He said it with the tone of a man who is simultaneously embarrassed and relieved, and I knew the feeling. When a thing is wrong and you can't see it, having someone come in and put their finger directly on it is a gift, even if the finding of it stings a little. I didn't say much to Perch, but when I left and walked down the street in the thin October sun, I was aware of a feeling that had been missing from my mornings for some time. I could not have named it precisely, but it had something to do with the sense that a thing I had started had roots in it and might hold. Her brother came on the 4th day. I saw the wagon coming down Main Street from the north, and I knew it before I had any particular reason to. There was something about the way it was moving, too purposeful for a man arriving to do business, too fast for someone who didn't know the streets. I was on the boardwalk outside my office with my coffee in my hand, and I stepped down into the street and stood where he would have to see me. He pulled up. His name was Harold Pryor, and he was a thick man in his mid-50s with a red face and eyes that were set close together, and hands that were large and slightly soft, the hands of a man who'd spent his working life handling ledgers and money rather than anything that built callous. His wife was not with him. He had a younger man on the seat beside him, hired help. I figured, there for the number, not because he'd be useful in any real way. He said, "I'm looking for a woman by the name of Clara Voss." I said, "What's your business with her?" He said, "That's a family matter." I said, "You're Harold Pryor." He looked at me a moment. "That's right." I said, "Your sister told me about you." A thing moved across his face when I said that. Not guilt exactly. More like the expression of a man who knows he's done wrong and has arranged himself not to think about it, and does not appreciate being reminded. He said, "I need to speak with her." I said, "You can speak with her if she's willing to. She's not obligated to see you and she knows that. I'll ask her." He got red in the face. He said, "Now look here, she is my blood relation and I said, "You drove her here in the dark and set her on a platform like baggage. You burned a placard to put around her neck. That's not how a man acts toward his blood relation. So you'll wait here while I ask her if she wants to talk to you, and if she doesn't, you'll drive back to Beale's Crossing and we'll both act like this conversation didn't happen." The young man beside him shifted on the seat and looked at the street. Harold Pryor was very red now. He was a man used to getting what he wanted in small ways in a small town, and he had no particular skill with being held up. He said, "My wife is sick." I said, "Is she?" He said, "She took ill 2 weeks ago. Fever. She needs looking after and I don't have anyone at the house." I said, "So, when she was well and wanted Clara gone, you drove Clara out. Now she's sick, and you want the use of Clara's hands again." He said, "You've got no right to talk to me that way." I said, "I've got every right. You came into my town and left a woman on my platform, and I am the law in this jurisdiction. So I've got the right, and what I'm telling you is true, and you know it." He sat there with his jaw working and no useful words coming out of it. Then he said, "I'd like to speak with her." I said, "I'll ask her." I went and I found Clara at the hotel desk. I told her exactly what was outside and why, including what he'd said about his wife. I did not omit anything and I did not add anything. I told it the way I told everything, plain and in the order it happened, and then I waited. She was quiet for a moment with her hands flat on the open register in front of her. The morning light came through the window on her left side, and she looked, in that moment, like a woman who had learned the hard way to think before she moved. She said, "I'll talk to him." I walked out with her and I stood back far enough to be visible but not close enough to hear. She walked up to the wagon and she stood there, not stepped up. She didn't climb up, she stood, and Harold Pryor had to look down at her. And there was something in how she stood that was different from how she'd sat on those depot steps 4 days ago. Not harder, just settled, like she knew the ground under her now and its particular weight. They talked for about 10 minutes. Harold did most of the talking. Clara listened with her arms crossed and her face steady. At some point, Harold reached into his coat and brought out an envelope. I saw her look at it and then look up at him. She said something, and he said something, and she said something else, and then she turned and walked back to me without taking the envelope. Then she stopped, turned back and took it. She came back to me. She said, "He wants me to come back and help his wife through her sickness." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him I'd think on it and send word within 3 days." I said, "That envelope." She said, "He's offering to pay me a wage this time. Not what I'm worth and he knows it, but a wage." I nodded. She said, "You think I should go?" I said, "I think it's your life and your choosing, and either way is a reasonable choice for a person in your circumstances." She said, "What would you do?" I said, "I wouldn't go back to a man who had treated me the way he treated you. But I've also never been in circumstances where the reasonable choice looked that much like going backward, so I'm not a reliable judge of what I'd do." She thought on that. She looked at the wagon pulling away down the street, Harold Pryor's broad back getting smaller. Then she said, "I told him 3 days." I said, "3 days is reasonable." That evening she knocked at my office door. I should say something about my office. It was the original marshal's office, built in 1861 when the town was new and the walls were put up thick to last. Adobe brick, 2 feet through, which meant the place held cool in summer and warm in winter, and did both better than most of the frame buildings the new money was putting up. I had a desk and a filing cabinet and a gun rack with 2 rifles on it, a Winchester and an older Sharps that I kept mostly out of loyalty, and a stove in the corner with a coffee pot on it that was going most hours of the day. The cell at the back hadn't held anyone in 2 weeks, which was longer than usual. The place smelled like gun oil and coffee and old paper, and the particular smell of years of the same work done in the same room, which is a smell I cannot separate from the smell of my own life. She came in and she sat down in the chair across from my desk. She had her coat still on, the gray wool coat with the mismatched button, and she held her hands in her lap and looked at me directly. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about not being a reliable judge of what you do in my circumstances." I said it was just an honest answer. She said, "I've been thinking about your circumstances." I said, "How do you mean?" She said, "The town council. Perch told me some of it. Are they going to try to take your job?" I looked at her for a moment. I said, "You don't have to worry about that." She said, "I'm not worried, I'm asking." There was a difference in the way she said it that made me answer straight. She wasn't asking out of nerves or politeness or the kind of social inquiry that doesn't want a real answer. She was asking because she wanted to know and intended to do something with the knowing. I said, "They're going to try, yes." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to continue doing my job, the way I have done it for 22 years and let them try." She said, "And if they call a vote?" I said, "Then we'll see what this town is." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What would it take for them to win?" I said, "Getting enough people to vote the right way, or making enough of the right people afraid to show up." She said, "What would it take for you to win?" I said, "People who know what I've done here and will say so in a public room." She said, "Do you have those people?" I was honest. I said, "I'm less certain than I was a few years ago. The town has changed. Some of the men who knew me best have either moved on or made their peace with the new arrangement and don't want the trouble of standing up." She looked at me steadily for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm not going back to Harold." I said, "All right." She said, "I'm going to stay in Garnet." I said, "Clara, you should know that I can't guarantee." She said, "I know you can't guarantee it. I'm not asking you to guarantee anything." She paused. "I'm telling you I'm staying, and I'd like to know if that's going to be a useful thing." I said, "Yes, I think it is." She said, "Then tell me who in this town owes you something." I said, "I don't do this work to be owed." She said, "I know that. I know you better than that already. But they owe you anyway, whether or not you kept track of it. A man who does right by people builds up a balance he never sees because he doesn't keep the ledger. Someone else has to." I looked at her. I said, "You're going to keep the ledger." She said, "Give me names." I gave her 8 names. I gave them slowly, because it required me to think about each man in a way I had not allowed myself to think for some time, not as a fact in the county, but as a person who owed something to another person, namely to me, and who might be asked to stand up and say so. It felt strange. It felt a little like asking, "I am not a man who asks." She left my office with those 8 names written on a folded piece of paper from my desk, and over the next 10 days, she spoke to every one of them. I know this because she told me each evening when she came by, and because 3 of the men told me themselves, separately, with the slightly sheepish tone of men who have done a thing they didn't expect to be doing and are not sure how to account for it. She had gone to each man plain and direct, and told him that the Marshal of Garnet, the one who had done this specific thing for him or that specific thing for his family, was being moved against by men who wanted a badge they could control, and she wanted to know if he was going to stand in a room and say what he knew. She didn't soften it. She didn't maneuver or flatter or hint. She laid out the situation and asked where each man stood. 6 said yes without hesitation. 1 said he needed time and came around to yes by the end of the week. 1 said he couldn't afford the trouble, which I understood, and I bore him no grudge. 6 was more than I had expected. I had thought on my harder mornings that I would stand alone in that room, and the thought had been one I was prepared to face, but that I did not find comfortable. 6 men willing to stand up in a public meeting and say what they knew about me. 6 was not nothing. 6 was, in fact, more than most men are given at the end of their useful years. The council sent me their letter in the 5th week. It came on the council's printed stationery, which was itself new since the last time they'd had cause to write me anything official. The paper was crisp, and the letterhead was engraved, because they were men who believed that the appearance of institution was part of institution's power. The letter said they were conducting a review of the marshal's position as part of a broader reorganization of the town's civic structure. It said they would be interviewing candidates for the role, and they invited me to submit my record for consideration, along with other applicants. Other applicants? I had been the Marshal of Garnet for 22 years. I had arrived in this town with $30 and a reputation I'd earned the only way a reputation of that kind gets earned, which is by doing the work right in places where doing it wrong was easier and more profitable. I had built this office not with my hands but with my years, and now they were inviting me to apply for it alongside other candidates, as if those 22 years were a line on a form and not a life's wait. I read the letter twice, then I set it on my desk. Leland came in while I was still sitting there with it in front of me, and he saw my face, which I do not generally let carry much, and he knew. He asked if he could read it. I gave it to him. He read it. His jaw got tight in the way that a young man's jaw gets tight when he's keeping himself from saying something that would feel good but not do any good. He said, "What do we do?" I said, "Go see Judge Hartwell." Judge Amos Hartwell had been on the bench in Garnet County since 1863. He was 71 years old and had a bad hip he managed with a cane he'd made himself from a piece of mountain ash, and he smoked a pipe whose smell reached 3 rooms ahead of him, and he was the most legally precise man I had ever sat across a table from. The council was afraid of him in the way that small men with large ambitions are always afraid of someone who has seen their kind before and is not impressed. They had not put his name on anything related to this. I found him in his chambers with his pipe going and a stack of case books beside him. He read the letter once and then read it again. He said, "They can't do this." I said, "Tell me why." He said, "Your appointment was made under a territorial charter provision dated 1857, which predates this council's authority by more than a decade. That provision creates a continuous office doctrine for the marshal's position, which means as long as the office is occupied and the holder is performing his duties, the position cannot be open to competition without a formal township vote, properly called and properly noticed, with cause stated and documented. A letter is not a vote. An interview process is not a vote. And they have no cause to state because you have done nothing wrong." He put the letter down on his desk and looked at it the way he looked at things that offended him, which was not with anger but with a kind of judicial contempt that was, in its way, much more devastating. He said, "I'll write them a letter of my own." I said, "Amos, when they get your letter, they're going to push harder. They've got money and they've got the new men in town and they're going to call a meeting." He said, "Let them call it." I said, "Will you come?" He said, "Will I come?" He looked at me over his pipe. "Has anything worth keeping ever been kept without a fight?" I said, "No." He said, "Then I'll come." I went back to my office. Clara was there. She had developed, over the preceding weeks, a habit of coming by my office in the afternoon to address whatever paperwork I had let accumulate, which in her view was always too much, and in my view was roughly the right amount. And we had a small ongoing disagreement about this that was one of the more pleasant disagreements I had ever had with anyone. She was at my filing cabinet when I came in, and she looked at my face and stopped what she was doing. I gave her the counsel's letter. She read it standing, which was how she read things that mattered standing, not sitting, as if the posture kept her from reacting before she'd finished. When she set it down on the filing cabinet, she did not look angry. She looked calm in a particular way, the way a person looks when they've been expecting something and it has finally arrived and now they can act. She said, "When are they going to call the meeting?" I said, "Hartwell thinks within 2 or 3 weeks." She said, "We have time." I said, "Clara." She said, "Don't tell me to step back from this." I said, "I wasn't going to. I was going to say I want you to be careful, because these are men with resources and they will not be gracious when they lose." She looked at me steadily. She said, "I was left on a depot step with a sign around my neck by my own brother. I have been handling men who were not gracious my entire adult life. I'm not afraid of these men." Then she said, "You walked over to me on those steps. You sat with me at breakfast and didn't make me feel like a problem. You put that sign face down against the wall. You got me a room and you stood in the street and said to my brother what I have needed someone to say to him for years. And now these men want to take the one thing you have left that nobody has been able to take from you yet." She paused. "I'm not going to stand aside for that." I didn't answer. There are moments when an answer would only get in the way. She picked up the letter and put it in the filing cabinet in the right place, which she had somehow learned, and she said, "I'm going to go talk to 2 more people. I'll be back before 5. I spent the days before the meeting doing my work exactly as I had done it for 22 years. I did not politic. I did not make speeches or court favor or go around reminding people of what I had done for them. Clara told me this was a mistake, and we argued about it in the easy way we had developed, which was a real argument. She meant what she said, and so did I, but conducted without heat. She said, "These people need to see you asking. Asking matters to people. It tells them you think they matter." I said, "I have never asked for anything in this town except that people tell the truth and pay their debts and keep from killing each other. I am not going to start asking for something else now." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You are the most stubborn man I have ever known." That is a statement that includes my late husband and my brother Harold. I said, "I take that seriously." She said, "You should." And then after a moment, "All right, do it your way." She did not stop working, though. She moved through the town in those 2 weeks with a quiet, purposeful steadiness that I watched with something close to wonder. She was not from here. She had been here less than 2 months. She had no history here, no connections, no debts owed to her, no particular reason to do any of it. And yet she walked into rooms and sat down with people and told them what was true in a plain voice that did not beg or dramatize, and she left those rooms having changed something. I will tell you one of those visits, because she told it to me, and because it says something about who she is. One of the names I had given her was a man named Cord Beaumont, who ran the feed and grain on the south end of Main Street. I had known Cord for 15 years. 10 years back, his oldest boy had gotten into serious trouble, the kind of trouble that ends one of 2 ways, which is either in a cell or on a boot hill. and I had managed it in a way that spared the boy both outcomes, partly by the particular use of my authority, and partly by speaking straight to the boy in a way that apparently landed, because he had been out of trouble ever since, and was now running his father's store 2 towns over. Cord Beaumont had shaken my hand afterward and said what he said, and I had never mentioned it again. Clara walked into his store and she said, "Mr. Beaumont, I'm Clara Voss. I've been in Garnet about 6 weeks. I want to talk to you about Marshall Hance." And Cord said, "What about him?" She said, "The town council is going to try to take his badge at a public meeting in 10 days. I'd like to know if you're going to be in that room." Cord said, "I don't want trouble with those men." She said, "I know. I'm not asking you to make trouble. I'm asking you to tell the truth in front of your neighbors, which is a different thing." Cord said, "How do you know Hance?" She said, "He found me on the depot steps 6 weeks ago with a sign around my neck saying I was cast off by my family. He took the sign off and bought me breakfast and got me a room and stood in this street and said things to my brother that needed saying. That's how I know him." She told me Cord Beaumont was quiet for a long moment after that. Then he said, "I'll be there." I heard about 2 other visits in a similar way, from the men themselves, who each told me afterward with the same sheepish tone, men who are not accustomed to being asked directly for something by a woman they don't know, and who found the directness of it somehow compelling in a way they could not entirely explain. What I understood, listening to them, was that what Clara was doing was not simply gathering votes. She was telling people a true story about a man, and the story happened to be true enough that they recognized it, and the recognition was what moved them. She was not selling anything. She was holding up a lamp and saying, "Here is what is there. Look at it. You know what you see." I had never had anyone do that for me. In 22 years of work in this town, I had done the work and let the work speak, and the work had spoken, but it had spoken quietly, in the private places of the people it had touched, and it had never been gathered up and said aloud in one voice. Clara gathered it, she said it aloud. I will not forget that. The night of the meeting, she walked to the assembly hall with me. The cold had settled in properly by then, the kind of cold that stops being weather and becomes climate, that gets into the ground and the stones and the walls of buildings and stays until spring decides to do something about it. The lamps along Main Street were lit early because the dark came early now, and their light on the frozen mud of the street made a pattern of orange circles that ended at the assembly hall, which was lit from inside, warmly and fully, all its windows burning. I had dressed carefully. I don't say that to be vain about it. I say it because it was deliberate. I had worn my good coat, the one I kept for occasions that required the badge to be seen clearly, and I had cleaned the badge that morning and polished it with the particular piece of flannel I kept for the purpose. I had been wearing this badge for 22 years, and I had polished it every time it needed polishing, and I was going to wear it into that room looking like what it was, a working lawman's badge on a man who had earned the right to wear it, still wearing it, still here. Clara had on her gray coat, the same one she'd been wearing on the depot steps, but with a new button now matching the others, brown replaced with black. She had done that quietly some weeks back and had not said anything about it, and I had noticed it and not said anything either, and somehow the not saying was its own small conversation between us. We did not talk much as we walked. She had been quiet all afternoon, not in a troubled way but in the collected way she got before something important, like a woman accounting to herself what she had and what the sum of it was. I had spent the afternoon the same way, in my own fashion, which was to sit in my office and drink coffee and think about the 22 years. Not with regret, not with anxiety about what might happen in that room, more like a man who is going to make an accounting in public and wants to know what the accounting honestly is, not what he hopes it is. The accounting was this: I had done the work. I had done it honestly and without corruption and without cruelty, which are not small things when you hold the kind of power a marshal holds in a small town, where the law is only as good as the man wearing it. I had made mistakes and I had lived with them, and I had tried not to repeat them. I had buried 2 deputies who were better men than the years they got, and I had carried that. I had kept this town through things that could have broken it, and some things that almost did. That was the accounting. It was not everything a man could have hoped for his life, but it was solid, it would hold. At some point, without discussion or announcement, she put her hand through my arm. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just the way you do when it is cold and someone is walking beside you, and the contact makes sense. I felt the weight of her hand, and I did not say anything about it, and neither did she. But I was aware of it for every step from there to the hall, the particular weight and warmth of it, and what it meant that it was there. The room was near full. The council had arranged it for a smaller crowd, and they had gotten a larger one, which told them something they would pretend, in the days afterward, that it hadn't told them. There were ranchers in their working clothes and merchants in their good clothes, and 2 women from the church who had been in this town longer than most of the council members had been alive. An old Matthias Cord in the 3rd row, who was 81 years old and had driven himself 6 miles in from his place in the dark and the cold, which told me the decision to come had been made well before this evening. I sat at the front with Leland to my right. Clara sat directly behind me in the 2nd row. I did not look back at her, but I was aware of her. The council ran the meeting. Cyrus Abel spoke first, for a long time, with a great deal of language about the town's future and the importance of professional management, and the need for leadership that could grow with the community's ambitions. He never said my name. He never said the word remove. He spoke entirely in the language of going forward, which is the language men use when they want to take something from you without having to say so directly. Then Hartwell spoke. He was brief, 3 minutes at most. He cited the charter provision and the continuous office doctrine and 2 additional territorial statutes, and he used the word unlawful twice in connection with the process the council had initiated. He said any vote purporting to open the marshal's position to competition, taken at this or any subsequent meeting, would be legally void, and he would file for an injunction before the week was out. He said all of this in his normal voice, which was measured and unhurried and without visible emotion, and then he sat down. There was a silence in the room. Cyrus Abel said this wasn't about removal, it was a civic conversation about the future. Hartwell did not respond to that, he simply looked at his notes. Then the floor was open. The first man to stand was Matthias Cord. He was slow getting up, the way a very old man is slow, and he gripped the back of the pew in front of him until he was standing straight. He did not turn to the room. He spoke to the front of it, in a voice that was old but clear. He said, "I've been in this county since most of you weren't born yet. I've seen 4 marshals in this town. One was a drunk and one was a coward and one was halfway honest when it suited him. This one is the only man who ever came out to my place in a blizzard, in the dark, on a horse that had every right to refuse him, because my hand had ridden in to say there was trouble and I was alone out there. He came. That's all I have to say. I'm not here for a speech. I'm here because that matters." And then he sat down, slowly the same way he'd gotten up. After him they stood in order. The liveryman, Brewster, who spoke for less than a minute and said what he'd seen over 11 years. Falk, who farmed east of town, who told a specific story about a specific night that I will not recount here because it involves another man's private trouble, and that man is dead, and his family is not. 2 of the ranchers who had been in Garnet since before the railroad. Almeda Goss, who had been a widow in this town for 15 years and who said 3 sentences that I will carry with me until I am in the ground. I will not repeat them. They were said to me, and about me, and they were said from feeling, and they belonged to the inside of that room on that particular night. The council had their speakers. There were 4 of them, men with interests in the new commerce, men with suits from catalogs and ambitions from somewhere east of here. They spoke about the future and professionalism and the changing needs of a growing town. They did not look at me when they said it. When it was done and the vote was taken, the motion failed, not closely, by a margin that was, to my mind, not in any doubt. I sat there afterward while the room talked around me and people made their way out. I was aware that I had won something, and I was aware that the way I had won it, in a room with people who'd driven in from their farms in the dark and cold to say what they knew, was not a thing I had known with certainty was coming. I had believed it was possible. I had done the work, but I had not been certain, and the not having been certain made the having of it land with a weight I had not entirely expected. Clara sat down next to me after most of the room had cleared. The council members had gone, all of them, without speaking to me, which I expected and did not mind. Hartwell had stopped and shaken my hand on his way out and said, "Good night, Marshal," with a particular emphasis on the second word that was as close as Amos Hartwell ever came to expressing satisfaction. She sat beside me and she didn't say anything for a while. The hall was nearly empty. Someone was extinguishing the far lamps one at a time, moving toward us, so the light contracted slowly across the room, pulling itself in. She said, "How do you feel?" I said, like a man who found out he had more of a town than he thought he did. She said, "You did the work, they knew you. The town was always there." I said, "You found the people." She said, "I went and asked. That's all I did. They knew what they knew. I just asked them to say it out loud." I looked at her. In the contracting light, her face was tired but settled, the face of a person who has done a hard thing correctly and knows it and does not need to be congratulated for it. I said, "I want to say something." She said, "All right." I said, "I have been in this town for 22 years. I have done this work, and it has been most of my life. And there have been stretches of it where what I was doing felt like maintaining the habit of a person rather than being one. Years that went by in the doing of necessary things without very much of what I would call living in the warmer sense of that word. I don't say that as complaint. I say it because I want you to know what these past weeks have been different from." She was very still. Outside, through the high window, the mountains were white-topped against a sky going to deep blue. I said, "The morning I found you on those steps and you looked up at me and said Marshal, not like it was just a title, like it still stood for something. I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone look at me that way, and I find, having remembered it, that I do not want to give it up." She put her hand over mine on the pew between us. Not with drama, not with words, just the plain fact of her hand over my hand, warm and still. She said, "It stands for something. You stand for something." Then she said, "I know what I'm staying for." The last lamp in the far corner went out. The room was lit only by the two nearest us and by what came through the windows from the street. I could hear the cold outside, the way very cold air has a sound if you're warm enough to hear it. I said, "I can't promise you ease." She said, "I've never had ease. I've had good and I've had hard, and mostly I've had both at once, the same as everyone." I said, "Then I'd like to make you the better kind of both." She looked at me. Something in her face shifted, not to softness exactly, but to a kind of arrival, the look of a woman who has been moving through difficult country for a long time and has come to a place where she recognizes the ground. She said, "I'd like that." The morning after the meeting I came in early, as I always did, and I walked the platform at the depot. The 6:15 was on time. The sky was cloudless and the mountains were clear and white, and the cold was sharp enough that my breath came out in a steady visible cloud. I stood at the south end of the platform and I looked up the empty track, and I thought about the morning 6 weeks earlier when I had come to this same platform and found a woman on those steps. It seemed to me standing there that a man's life can turn on very small things. Not the large things, not the battles or the crises, those you see coming and you square up to them and they pass and you are marked by them or you are not, but the small things. A cold morning, an early walk. A woman sitting where you did not expect to find one. A habit you've kept so long it stopped feeling like a choice and has become simply who you are, simply the thing you do before breakfast because that is what you have always done. If I had not walked the platform that morning, she would have sat on those steps until the 6:15 came through or until someone else found her, and I don't know what would have happened to her then. I try not to think about what might have happened to her then. But I also think, if she had not been there, I would have walked the platform and walked back to my breakfast and spent another day in the quiet that had become my weather, and I would not have known what I was missing because I had forgotten what it felt like to have it. I thought about that for a while, standing on the platform with my cold breath going out in a cloud. Then I went and had breakfast. She was at Sadie's when I got there. She had the same table, the one she'd first sat at 6 weeks before, which I found either coincidental or the kind of choice that doesn't feel like one. She looked up when I came in and said good morning, and poured coffee from the pot that Sadie had left on the table, which was something she had apparently arranged with Sadie, who had taken a great liking to Clara in the way that women of a certain age and character recognize each other. I sat down. She looked at me across the table. She said, "How are you feeling this morning?" I said, "Like myself again." She smiled at that, not a large smile. She was not a woman who made large gestures when small ones said the thing exactly. She poured herself coffee and she said, "Good." We sat there and ate breakfast, and the morning came properly through Sadie's window, and the town woke up outside. And it was, in its small way, as good a morning as I had had in longer than I could immediately name. Leland Cross was there, and Perch Walcott and old Matthias Cord, who drove himself in again from 6 miles out, and who shook my hand afterward with both of his and did not speak, but did not need to. Sadie Friel, who was not invited but had somehow found out and appeared at the door with a pie and tears she was embarrassed about, which we pretended very hard not to notice. We had dinner at Sadie's after, which I have mentioned before is the best food in the county. Clara had eggs and I had eggs, because that is what we had eaten the morning we met, and it had seemed, without discussion, the right thing to eat. I kept my badge. I wore it another 7 years, until the hip that had been broken in the livery fire of '71 gave out enough that I couldn't ride with any reliability, and by that time the town council had turned over twice, and the men who had tried to move against me were largely gone to other places or other pursuits, and nobody talked about reorganization and professionalism the way they once had. When I turned in my badge, I turned it in on my own terms, to a man I had trained, on a morning when the county was quiet and the mountains had their first new snow of the season. I set it on the desk and I looked at it for a moment, the particular look of a worn thing that has been carried a long time, and then I walked out. That was that. Clara kept the hotel books for Perch until Perch died, and then she helped his widow run the place for a time, and then she helped the widow sell it when the widow wanted to go back east to her sister. She had a talent for numbers, and for the kind of practical organization that makes the difference between a business that works and a business that just keeps moving, and she used it for years in one form or another. I do not know how to talk about what the daily life of a good marriage is like, because it is mostly small things, and the small things are not individually remarkable. It is coffee at the same table every morning, the same 2 cups, the same order of drinking them. It is a woman who knows when you are troubled and does not make you say so before she sits down beside you, and is simply there until the troubled thing passes or becomes manageable. It is an argument about paperwork that is really about 2 people who see the world differently, and have decided that the difference is interesting rather than intolerable. It is learning a person's habits, the way she reads with the book held slightly too close, the way she hums without knowing she's doing it when she's working on something that requires concentration, the way she stands at a window in the early morning before the day starts and looks at whatever is outside with the same expression she had on those depot steps, which I have come to understand is not resignation, but simply the act of taking inventory of where she is. It is her hand on your arm on a cold night. It is the particular sound she makes before she is fully awake in the morning, which belongs only to that hour and to the two of us, and which tells me each morning that I hear it, that I am not alone in my own house, in my own life, in the years I have remaining. I want to tell you about one particular evening, because it happened in the second year of our marriage, and I have not forgotten it, and I don't expect to. I had come in from a long day that had included a dispute between two men that had come close to going badly before it went right, and my hip was giving me trouble, which it did when I had been on my feet since early, and I sat down in the chair in the front room, and I did not get up again. I just sat there with my hat on my knee, and the lamp burning low, and the weight of the day, and the years and the hip, and the quiet particular way that age accumulates settling over me all at once. Clara came in from the other room. She looked at me. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not make any of the sounds of sympathy that a person makes when they don't know what else to do. She came, and she sat down on the arm of the chair, which was not proper and not particularly comfortable for either of us, and she put her arm around my shoulders, and she just sat there. We stayed like that for a while. The lamp burned. The town made its quiet sounds outside. Then she said quietly, not looking at me, just talking to the room, "You are a good man. I know that's not the easiest thing to be in the long run, but it matters. It mattered to this town, and it matters to the people whose lives you've changed, and it matters to me. I want you to know that." I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have made less of it. After a while she got up and went and made coffee, and I put some more wood in the stove, and we sat at the table and drank it, and that was that. But I have carried those words. I have carried them on the hard mornings and the long days and the nights when the hip keeps me from sleeping, and I lie there in the dark wondering whether the sum of a life amounts to anything that will hold. I have carried them, and they hold. I did not expect, at 58 years old, to find what I found on a depot platform on a cold October morning. I did not expect a woman left on steps like unwanted freight to become, in a matter of weeks, the person without whom I am diminished. I had lived a long time, and I had done useful things, and I had kept my code, and I had gotten accustomed to the quiet that a man gets accustomed to when what is useful and what is warm are not the same thing. I was wrong to get accustomed to it. Or perhaps not wrong, perhaps it was only that the thing I had gotten accustomed to was waiting to be changed, and the change was going to come when it came, and there was no use in having expected it. She came off a depot step with a valise in her hand and $4.60, and the steady eyes of a woman who had been through harder things than me, and who had not let them make her small. She came into my town and into my office and into my life, and she stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go. She had proven in those weeks that she could make a place for herself anywhere, but because she chose to. That is the whole of it when you come down to it. A good woman, a strong one, with her own will and her own code, choosing this man, these years, this life. There is nothing worth more than that. I know it now in the way you only know a thing when you have lived both sides of it, the having and the not having, and you have been lucky enough to have the having come after. I am an old man. My hip is bad, and the cold gets into it earlier every year, and I do not ride anymore, which is a loss I feel in a particular way that I will not dramatize. The mountains still have their snow. The town is still the town, different in its particulars from what it was, the same in the ways that are the town's own character and will not change. I walk the depot platform most mornings still, when the weather allows. Old habit. The 6:15 still comes through from Tucson, on time when it's on time and late when it isn't, and the freight office is still locked until 7. I stand at the south end and I look up the track and I breathe the cold air, and I remember what I found on those steps, on a morning not so different from this one, 20-odd years back. A woman on a step, a placard, $4.60, and a mismatched button and eyes steady enough to take your measure before they let you close. I have thought more than once that the town council, those men with their printed stationery and their suits from catalogs, did me a service they did not intend. If they had left me alone and let me run out my years in the quiet that had become my weather, I might have done so. I might have finished the work and laid down my badge and gone home to an empty house and called it a complete life. It would not have been untrue. But it would have been incomplete in a way I would not have named, because I did not know what I was missing. They pushed, and pushing brought the meeting, and the meeting brought those men out of their farms and their small rooms and their settled habits to stand up in a room and say what they knew. And through all of it she moved, steady and purposeful, with her hand full of 8 names and her voice full of plain truth. She made it possible, she made it known. Clara is in the next room. I can hear her moving, the particular sound of her in the morning, making coffee, the cabinet door, and then the stove, the same small sounds in the same order. In a few minutes she will come through this door, and she will set a cup down at my elbow, and she will look at me. I cannot tell you what that look is, not in a way that would be accurate. I have tried in my mind, and I cannot find the words that would hold it. It is not pity, and it is not duty. It is not the look of a woman performing a kindness. It is the look of a woman who chose this man, this face, this particular life on her own terms, with her eyes open, knowing what she was choosing, and who looks at him each morning like the choice was right, and she has not once been sorry for it. That is what I have to tell you. The rest of it is hers and mine, and it belongs to us. That is enough.